that's worth thinking about as we move forward. So what are all those pictures about at the back? That's really what this slide's about. And what I want to do is go through a couple of these pictures and tell you my thoughts on them. I'm not going to go through all 300 or whatever we have on the back boards, but 10 or 15 here, and give you a little insight into maybe why I thought they were worth looking at. And I'm glad this one has some green dots on it. I've already cheated and looked at how these pictures are being graded. But this is a little village that was developed by Prince Charles, of all people, in Poundbury in England. It's about 3 hours south of London, and drawn up by a guy named Leon Creer, who's a very famous academic planner. Hadn't really built a lot until Poundbury came along. He'd done lots of drawings and pictures and envisioned things and spent most of his career teaching up at that time. But they have the most interesting concept of a village square. It's actually their parking lot for what you would call their main street. They don't have a main street, it's a square, and all the shops are in the square. When they have special events, all the cars come out of there, and they don't have asphalt, they just have this granular crush. I suppose it's a limestone crush. So it's a multi-purpose space, which is a really interesting way of thinking about streets and spaces, being both for cars and also for special events. So that's very interesting. And then they have this very quaint architecture as well, which is very low in scale. And I believe this is Chemainus, and I wanted to throw that in because you can look at your cousins just up the highway, and I don't know if you're the poor cousin or the wealthy cousin for Chemainus, but you know, obviously they envisioned something and they had some ideas, and they said, let's be the city of murals. And I think it was fairly successful for them. And that probably took some creative thought on somebody's part. And it was an idea that they've been fairly successful on. And I did go through there a couple of months ago, I think in September, when I came down for one of the meetings, one of the interviews after I was selected. And it was bustling. It was really impressive. There was a lot of people in Chemainus, a lot of cameras. So a lot of pictures of the back are from the East Coast. This is in Mahone Bay. And I don't know, has anybody been to Mahone Bay in Nova Scotia? Yeah, a few people are familiar with it. It's on the water, geographically very similar to Crofton. And at one point in time, it was fairly run down. And what they decided to do was do the 10-gallon overhaul. So there's not a lot of new buildings there, but there's been a lot of development there by people taking these old cottages and being creative with them. So you can't park in Mahone Bay in the summertime. It is just packed with pedestrians. And it's filled with art galleries, ice cream parlors, trinket shops, you name it. There's a bank there, there's a couple of grocery stores, but you can see the architecture is very poor, but it's got lots of charm and ambience because they've used color, they've used landscaping, and they've made it quite cheerful. And then some of the buildings are very simple, but with these bright colors, and there's a boat on the side, you can see the flowers they have on the hydro poles there. The art, the materials they've used, very simple wood materials, but they create a lot of people spaces. Not very expensive to do, but really changes the appearance and makes you want to come to that place. This is in Guildford. Actually, I was glad to see there was lots of green dots on this slide too, rather than red dots. I have two images of Guildford in the back there. Guildford is also in England. It's about halfway between Poundbury and London, so it's about 2 hours outside of London, but it's a shopping town, and it's all about shopping in Guildford. And Guildford has this wonderful big mall. It used to be a main street, and now most of the time it's closed off. Certainly during the holiday seasons, all summer and over Christmas. I was there at Christmas a couple of years ago. And then they have these side streets, which are very quaint. They're kind of like courtyards, if you will, and they're protected from the elements, and they're kind of you're not sure if you're inside or you're outside when you're there, but it's kind of a neat thing. So I thought I'd throw that in. And then, you know, this is the classic image. This always gets green dots anywhere you would show it to folks, because it's the bench in the shade, it's the big mature tree, it's the sidewalk with the signs that are very inviting, the convenient parking, the easy parking near the shops, and a friendly main street. So it's a very friendly situation, and I see there's lots of green dots on this one too, so that's something to think about. And then here's an image mostly about landscaping, but about signage, and there's actually a lot of design thought into this. There's a color scheme, there's a thought about handcrafted signage, there's a lot of care taken to the garden, and there is some thought to the architecture and the motifs of the architecture, very heritage-oriented here. This is a historic building, but there's possibilities of encouraging that kind of development within Crofton, and that seemed to get lots of points. And then we wanted to make sure as planners, you got to weigh in on these larger buildings, and I can see there's so far not a lot of appetite on those backboards for 4 stories. Maybe it's a little out of scale with Crofton, or it's a little far to reach, but I think there's lots of dots on 3-story things, and so I think if density is drawn correctly, people are attracted to it. And then the idea of row housing, so there's other forms of housing besides single family. There's row housing, there's town housing. Row housing is essentially where you want to pretend you live in a single family house, because behind this you have your private garden, but you have the party wall on either side. And this is in America, you can see the American flag, but it's something you would also see on the East Coast in Toronto. And then here's sort of the stucco North Vancouver style, or maybe in Nanaimo or Victoria. Not row housing, but town housing, and there's probably underground parking in that project. And it's very close to the street, but much higher density than single family. And then when you get creative with architecture, you can do that kind of density that looks quite different. This is also townhousing with underground parking, and the townhouses are separated from each other with a garden rather than a parking lot. So that's another way of thinking about it. Obviously, underground parking is very expensive, so you've got to weigh that into the cost of doing that type of project. And then here's another look at what some of these things may look like. These 2 projects are in Vancouver. And then there's single-family housing, but on very, very small lots. And this probably was 1 lot at one time, and they divided it, and you can see just in the back there's 2 more houses. So they took 1 lot and they put 4 single-family houses on it. And what could that do in Crofton? Well, it could be very affordable architecture. If it's a $100,000 lot suddenly is a $25,000 lot, you can spend more money on the architecture, and then young families could move in there, and they could have kids, and you could keep that school going, and that school could become a community school, and it could have all sorts of amenities for older folks. So that's a way of thinking about it. And then the classic mixed use, which you see all over the West Coast now, in smaller and larger communities, commercial on the ground floor and then apartments above. And those apartments are often 2-bedroom apartments, more oriented, I would say, to seniors than to young families, but also other segments of the population, divorcees, people who never marry or don't have a partner. So there's other ways of thinking about that to be inclusive. So I think a good plan typically has lots of different types of housing in it and creates a diverse community, which is a nice place to live. And then here's another idea, and one of the things that you really have going for you as a community is you're a village of laneways. You have all these alleyways, at least close to the main street. And those are tremendous opportunities. You can't bring those in after somebody's created a subdivision. And basically what they are is a second set of streets. And as probably you've read about, if you read the Vancouver news, is Vancouver has blanketed this zoning across the city now. Anywhere where there's an alley, you have a right to build a second dwelling on your own lot. It has to be less than 600 square feet, basically, so they're very small. But it's essentially doubling the number of housing units in many of these neighborhoods. It'll take many years to double the units. Not everybody's doing it, but it's a creative way of looking at space. And often you may want that just for a family member, or you may want to rent that out to help your income. Or you may want that because you want to move in there and rent your main house out when you retire and then spend your winters in the south of France. So there's different ways of looking at that. Did I switch over one? And then another form of housing, which not many people are familiar with, but it's this idea of taking a big house and putting 4 units in it. And this happens in many old neighborhoods that have large houses where the land all used to go up, and so a developer will come in and put 4 condos within the envelope of an existing house. But it also happens on vacant lots. And you end up with the same density as those townhouse images, those row house images you see, but it has that feeling of a single family house. This is actually on the UBC campus. I'm not terribly fond of the architecture, but I wanted to show you the idea. And then finally in the charrette, we want to talk a little bit about infrastructure, what happens on the ground with landscaping and things. The idea of roundabouts, I could already see the opportunity to cap maybe your street up by the market with the roundabout. And then some ideas about green infrastructure. A lot of your stormwater already goes over the land. Not a lot of it goes into pipes, which can be a very positive thing as well as a negative thing. But hopefully through the design track, we'll teach you a little bit about some of these tricks we can do with infrastructure dealing with stormwater. And then finally, the idea of complete streets. You know, I don't know if you really need a bike lane in your main street right now. It's probably pretty safe and there's not a lot of traffic. But we certainly like to talk about it, get people to weigh in. And this is right next to the Vancouver City Hall, by the way, so it's a very urban situation. Neighborhood on this side, that's single family, but turning into row housing, and you can see on-street parking, big wide sidewalk in front of the City Hall. So that concludes my little part of the presentation. And then, Greg, do you have a little PowerPoint you want to throw on here?
Sure.
Yeah. So Greg's going to give you a little bit of an economic outlook on things.